I was kneeling on the icy hardwood floor, holding my grandfather's freezing hand, when his eyelids fluttered open just long enough to whisper the words that would change everything they don't know about. Help me get revenge. For a moment, I wasn't a Marine. I was just a granddaughter staring at a man who had been abandoned like an unwanted piece of furniture. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. 3 hours earlier, I was on the last leg of a 12-hour drive through a blizzard that had shut down half the state. My SUV was fighting for traction on every curve. But the thought of the fireplace at the Pines kept me going. I hadn't been back to the estate in 2 years. Not since my ER residency started eating my life whole. I pictured the massive stone hearth roaring. My parents, Richard and Susan, greeting me with hot cider. Maybe even a smile that didn't look practiced. I pictured Grandpa Arthur in his wingback chair, probably complaining about the snow, but secretly glad I'd made it. It was a stupid fantasy. I should have known better. When I finally pulled up the winding driveway, the estate looked wrong. Not peaceful. Dead. The windows were black squares against the white storm. No holiday lights. No smoke from the chimney. The entire property felt powered down, like a machine that had been unplugged. I keyed in the code at the front door, expecting the warm rush of forced air. Instead, the air inside hit me harder than the wind outside. It was stagnant and biting. My breath bloomed into a white cloud right there in the foyer. The silence wasn't restful. It was heavy. The kind of quiet you hear in a trauma bay after the flatline tone stops. I walked into the kitchen, my boots echoing too loudly on the marble. The smart home panel by the fridge was dead. They hadn't just lowered the temperature, they'd killed the main breaker. And then I saw it. A piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock sitting on the center island, anchored by a bowl of wax fruit. I picked it up. My father's handwriting. Sharp and angular, heading to St. Bart's. Don't wait up. Handle the old man. I stared at the note. Ent. Bart's. They were thousands of miles away, soaking in the sun, while the temperature inside the house dropped toward 0. Handle the old man. Not take care of your grandfather. Not sorry we missed you. Handle him. Like he was a leaking pipe or a broken window. That's when the analysis kicked in. In the ER, you learn to diagnose intent as quickly as injury. You see the difference between an accident and an assault. This note wasn't an oversight. It was a discard. My parents are narcissists of the highest order, the kind who don't get their hands dirty. They don't scream or hit. They just remove their attention. When Grandpa Arthur stopped being the source of their status and started becoming a burden, they didn't kill him. That would be messy. They just turned him off. They left him here, in the dark and cold, assuming nature would do the dirty work for them. It was a clinical, calculated erasure. I dropped the note and ran toward the master suite on the ground floor. The door was heavy. Solid oak. I pushed it open, and the cold rushing out was physical. A wall of ice. Grandpa was in the bed. A small mound under a single sheet. His lips were the color of a bruise. I touched his cheek. It felt like marble. I checked the vents, taped over with duct tape. This wasn't negligence. This was an execution. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I went to work. I stripped off my heavy coat and threw it over him. I raided my trauma kit from the truck: thermal blankets, chemical heat packs, saline bags. I warmed against my own skin. I started an IV in the dark, my hands steady only because they had to be. I rubbed his limbs, generating friction, talking to him in that low, demanding voice I used on patients who were trying to slip away. You don't get to leave. Arthur, Not like this. Not on their terms. It took 40 minutes for the ambulance to fight its way up the mountain. By the time they loaded him onto the stretcher, his pulse was thready, but there. I climbed in the back, holding his hand, watching the monitor trace the weak rhythm of his heart. He was alive, and as the siren wailed, cutting through the silence of the storm, I realized something. I had spent my life trying to be the perfect daughter, the fixer, the one who cleaned up their messes. But tonight, the daughter died in that freezing house. The nurse survived, and the nurse knew exactly what to do with a tumor. You cut it out. The monitors in the ICU hummed with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Grandpa Arthur was stabilized, warmed, and wired up to half a dozen machines. But he was awake. His eyes, usually sharp with the intelligence of a man who had designed skyscrapers, were cloudy. But the steel behind them hadn't melted. I stood by the bed, my phone in my hand, ready to dial the sheriff's department. I had the medical report: hypothermia, dehydration, evidence of neglect. It was enough for an arrest. No, he rasped. The word was barely a sound, just a friction of air against his dry throat. He lifted a hand, shaking, to stop me. Not yet. Noah. Not the police. They tried to kill you. Arthur. I said, my voice low and hard. This isn't a family dispute. It's attempted manslaughter. If you call them now, he whispered, fighting for breath. Richard and Susan will claim it was an accident, a misunderstanding. They have lawyers. They have spin. They'll walk away with a slap on the wrist and they'll still have the house. He gripped my wrist, his skin papery, but his grip desperate. I need you to go back to the house. Go to the studio. Find the tube. The one labeled Foundation 1985. I hesitated. Leaving him felt like a violation of my duty. But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't delirium. It was a plan. I drove back to the pines in the dark. The blizzard had passed, leaving the mountains buried in silence. The house was still warm from when I'd rebooted the breakers, but it felt hollow. I went straight to the east wing, to the architectural studio Grandpa had built 30 years ago. It smelled of cedar shavings and graphite. My father, Richard, had already raided the wall safe behind the painting. The door was ajar, the interior empty. He probably thought he'd won. He thought the money was in the obvious places. But Grandpa Arthur didn't build obvious things. I went to the drafting table. In the corner, a wire bin held dozens of vintage blueprint tubes. I found the one marked Foundation 1985. The cap was tight, sealed with wax that cracked when I twisted it. I pulled out the roll. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a legal document, thick and bound in blue paper. A living trust. I scanned the pages under the drafting lamp. It was dated 6 months ago. Arthur hadn't been senile. He had been watching. He knew. The terms were explicit, drafted with the precision of an architect who knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are. In the event of my incapacitation due to unnatural causes or suspected negligence by my primary beneficiaries, all assets immediately transfer to the sole trusteeship of Noah Sterling. He had set a trap. He knew they were waiting for him to die. So he created a mechanism that stripped them of everything the moment they tried to speed up the process. I held the document, feeling the weight of it. This was the weapon. But I knew it wasn't enough. A piece of paper could be contested in probate court for years. Richard and Susan would drag this out until there was nothing left to inherit. I needed something visceral. I needed proof of intent. I walked out of the studio and down the hall to the utility closet. My parents were obsessed with status. They bought the Pines because it was a trophy, filled with the latest technology they didn't understand. They treated the smart home system like a magic light switch. They didn't realize it was a surveillance network. They had manually shut off the furnace at the breaker box, thinking that killed the house. But the local server for the security system had a battery backup. It was designed to record during power outages. I pulled up the interface on the wall-mounted tablet. My fingers flew across the screen. Accessing the admin logs. I found the timestamp from 2 days ago, right before their flight to St. Bart's. I plugged in my headphones and hit play. The audio feed from the kitchen camera crackled to life. Just cut the breaker. Richard. My mother's voice said. It wasn't fearful. It was annoyed. He's 84. It's supposed to drop to 10 degrees tonight. Nature will take its course before we get back. It's a kindness. Really. And the inheritance tax is lower if he goes before January 1st. My father replied. I heard the click of a suitcase latch. It's cleaner this way. We save on the nursing home fees. I ripped the headphones off. The silence in the hallway was deafening. I felt a wave of nausea. Not from the cruelty, but from the casualness of it. They were discussing the murder of my grandfather with the same tone they'd used to discuss tax write-offs or dinner reservations. It was banal. It was transactional. I leaned against the wall, breathing through my nose, forcing my heart rate down. In the trauma unit, we have a protocol for mass casualties. It's called triage. You tag patients by color. Green is walking wounded. Yellow is urgent. Red is critical. And black. Black is for the ones who are already gone, or who can't be saved. You don't waste resources on black tags. You move on. Growing up, I spent my entire life trying to be the green tag for this family. I tried to be low maintenance, functional, the one who fixed things so Richard and Susan could shine. I thought if I was good enough, if I was successful enough, I could save them from their own selfishness. I thought I could heal the rot in this family. But listening to that audio, I realized the diagnosis had changed. My parents weren't patients. They were the disease. They were a necrosis, eating away at the legacy Arthur had built. You don't treat necrosis with kindness. You don't negotiate with gangrene. You excise it. You cut it out to save the healthy tissue. I downloaded the audio files to 3 separate cloud drives and a physical thumb drive. I pocketed the trust documents. I wasn't the daughter anymore. I wasn't even the nurse. I was the surgeon. And I was scrubbing in for an amputation. I picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on the back of the trust document. It wasn't a law firm. It was a private number. This is Elena. A voice answered on the first ring. Sharp. Professional. Alert. This is Noah. I said. I have the tube. And I have the tapes. Good. Elena said. I've been waiting for your call. Meet me at the bistro in town in 20 minutes. Bring everything. We have work to do. The bistro was quiet. The lunch rush long over. I spotted Elena immediately in the back booth. She didn't look like a family attorney. She looked like a shark in a silk blouse. Her laptop was open, casting a blue glow on her face. And she was typing with a speed that suggested she wasn't writing a greeting card. I slid into the booth across from her and placed the thumb drive on the table. It made a small click against the wood. You look like Arthur, she said, not looking up from her screen. Same jawline. Same inability to hide your disgust. I'm Noah. I know who you are. Arthur has a file on you. He's very proud. She finally stopped typing and looked at me. Her eyes were gray and terrifyingly intelligent. I'm Elena. And before we go further, I need to correct an assumption you probably made. I'm not a lawyer. I frowned. The trust document said to contact you for legal execution. I handle the execution, she said. A small, sharp smile playing on her lips. But I'm a forensic accountant. Arthur hired me 8 months ago, when he noticed some irregularities in the household accounts. He didn't want a lawyer who would send polite letters. He wanted someone who could follow the money to hell and back. She took the thumb drive and plugged it into her machine. While the files loaded, she turned the screen toward me. It was a spreadsheet. Rows and rows of transactions. Highlighted in angry red. Your father, Richard, has always been terrible at math, Elena said. Her tone, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. He thinks if he moves money from the trust to an LLC, and then to his personal account, it disappears. It doesn't disappear. It leaves a trail. She pointed to a figure at the bottom of the column. $450,000. The number hung in the air between us. That's what he's siphoned from the estate in the last 5 years. She continued. He's been funding his failing consultancy firm, the country club memberships, the leases on the Range Rovers, and that trip to St. Where. Bart's paid for with a withdrawal he labeled emergency home repairs. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about them trying to kill Grandpa for convenience. They were broke. They were desperate. They needed him dead because the money was running out. And if he died, the trust would dissolve into their pockets before anyone could audit the books. This is grand larceny. I said, it's wire fraud, embezzlement, and elder financial abuse. Elena corrected. And since the trust operates across state lines, it's federal. We aren't looking at a civil suit. Noah. We're looking at 10 to 20 years in federal prison. She opened the audio files from the thumb drive. She listened to the clip, my mother's voice suggesting they let nature take its course through her earbuds. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. Attempted manslaughter, she added to the list. That's the cherry on top. She closed the laptop. The snap was final. We have everything we need to indict them right now, Elena said. I can have the FBI at the airport when they land. No, I said. The decision came from somewhere deep in my gut. I didn't want them arrested in a sterile airport terminal where they could cause a scene and play the victim. I wanted them to come home. I wanted them to walk into the house they thought they owned, feel the warmth they thought they'd extinguished, and realize they had lost everything in the very place they tried to steal. I want them to come back to the Pines. I said, I want them to see him alive. Elena studied me for a moment, then nodded. The trap, she said approvingly. I like it. They land next Tuesday. I'll have the sheriff's deputies on standby just out of sight. We let them walk in. We let them incriminate themselves one last time. And then we drop the hammer. I looked at the thumb drive. The digital witness to their cruelty. Let's do it. The week leading up to their return felt less like waiting and more like setting a bone. It was precise, painful, and necessary. Elena and I worked out of the library, turning the estate into a fortress of evidence. We printed bank statements, notarized the living trust, and handed everything over to the sheriff's department. They issued the warrants quietly. They agreed to my terms, no sirens, no lights, just a silent perimeter waiting for the signal. On Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the wing-back chair in the great room. A fire roared in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the high stone walls. The house was 72 degrees. It felt alive again. Grandpa Arthur sat in his wheelchair in the shadows of the alcove. Invisible from the front door, but perfectly positioned to see everything. At 4 o'clock, a black town car pulled up the heated driveway. I watched through the window as Richard and Susan got out. They looked like advertisements for a life they couldn't afford. Tanned. Rested. Wearing cashmere and sunglasses. They didn't look like people coming home to a tragedy. They looked like people coming home to a payday. They dragged their luggage up the steps. I heard the keypad beep. The door swung open. And they stepped into the warmth. For a second, they just stood there. Confused. They were expecting the bite of freezing air. They were expecting silence. Instead, they felt the heat and saw me sitting by the fire, nursing a mug of tea. "Noah," my mother said. Her voice wasn't relieved. It was sharp. Startled. She dropped her sunglasses. "What are you doing here? I came to check on Grandpa." I said, my voice flat. "I found your note." The color drained from Richard's face. Beneath the tan, he exchanged a frantic look with Susan. Then, the performance started. It was Oscar-worthy. "Oh, thank God," Susan gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "We were so worried. The smart home app went offline, and we couldn't reach anyone. Is he okay? The heater must have broken. We tried to call the repairman before we left." "But stop," I said. "Noah, you don't understand." Richard stepped in, using his reasonable father voice. "It's an old system. It glitches. We would never." I picked up the tablet from the side table. It was connected to the whole house audio system. "I don't want to hear your version, Richard. I want to hear the truth. And luckily, the house remembers everything." I pressed play. My mother's voice boomed from the cathedral ceilings. Distorted slightly by the amplification, but undeniable. "Just cut the breaker, Richard. He's 84. Nature will take its course before we get back." Susan froze. Her mouth hung open. But no sound came out. She looked at the ceiling speakers as if they were possessed. Then, Richard's voice followed, echoing off the stone walls. "It's cleaner this way. We save on the nursing home fees." The silence that followed the recording was heavier than the blizzard had been. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. The arrogance was gone. The mask had slipped, revealing the terrified, greedy man underneath. That's taken out of context," he stammered. Sweating now. "We were talking about the plumbing. The pipes. You were talking about murder," I said. "And grand larceny. $450,000. Richard, Elena found every cent you stole." "Who the hell is Elena?" he shouted, stepping toward me aggressively. "I am," Elena said, stepping out from the kitchen hallway. She wasn't holding a weapon, just a stack of files. But she looked more dangerous than a soldier. "You can't prove anything," Susan screeched, her panic rising to a fever pitch. "This is our house. He's senile. He doesn't know what he's doing. Where is he? Is he dead? I'm right here." A voice rasped. Richard and Susan spun around. Grandpa Arthur rolled his wheelchair out of the alcove. He looked frail. Yes. But his head was high. He looked at them with a mixture of sorrow and absolute, crushing disappointment. "Dad," Richard whispered. "Dad. You bet on the cold," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of the entire mountain. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was just an obstacle between you and your inheritance. But you forgot something. I built this house. I know where the insulation is. And I know a structural failure when I see one. He lifted the vintage blueprint tube from his lap. "You're evicted," he said. Elena signaled the window. Outside, the driveway flooded with red and blue lights. The sheriff's deputies hadn't used their sirens. But they were there. The trap hadn't just sprung, it had shattered them. Richard slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. Susan started screaming. A high, thin sound that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with losing the only thing she loved, her status. Watching them be escorted out in handcuffs wasn't triumphant. It was necessary. It was a surgical procedure. Richard was charged with attempted manslaughter, grand larceny, and wire fraud. Susan was charged as an accomplice. As they were placed in the back of separate squad cars, neither of them looked at me. They were too busy looking at the house, realizing it would never belong to them. The red and blue lights faded down the mountain road, leaving the estate in darkness again. But this time, it wasn't a cold darkness. It was peaceful. I went back inside. Elena was packing up her files. She gave me a curt nod, the professional acknowledgement of a job done right, and left us to our privacy. I sat by the fire with Grandpa. He was staring into the flames, a heavy sadness in his eyes. It's a terrible thing to realize you raised monsters. It's a heavy burden to be the one who has to lock them away. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking his hand. It was warm now. "I will be," he said. "The house is quiet. It's safe." He reached for the pen on the side table and the trust documents. With a shaky but determined hand, he signed the final page. The estate, the remaining assets, everything was transferred to the Eleanor Trust. "I don't want this money, Grandpa," I said softly. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm giving it to you. You won't spend it on St. Bart's. You'll use it to make sure no one else freezes." I looked at the signature. This was the seed. We weren't just rebuilding a family, we were building a fortress. We were going to use the resources Richard and Susan had tried to steal to fund legal aid and emergency housing for victims of elder financial abuse. I thought about the concept of revenge. For days, I had wanted to hurt them. I had wanted them to suffer the way Grandpa suffered in that freezing room. But looking at the fire, I realized something. Revenge is burning the house down to kill the rats. It leaves you with nothing but ash. Justice is different. Justice is evicting the rats, sealing the cracks, and keeping the house warm for the people who deserve shelter. I didn't have to become cruel to beat them. I just had to be competent. I had to be the nurse who refused to let the patient die on her watch. I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered peaks. The storm was over. The foundation had held. They underestimated the nurse. And they forgot that the foundation of this house was built on truth. If you've ever had to stand between a predator and a loved one, share this story. You are the firewall.